HIV, AIDS, and the pandemic, which, of course, as you would know, would have been a very important and remains a very important social health and public health issue in our country, certainly South Africa, but certainly the continent at large. And so certainly very relevant. She's also looked into a range of things, and I think most aptly packaged in her first book, which was Love, Money, and HIV, becoming a modern African woman in the age of AIDS, and the second book, Death by Design, producing racial health inequality in the shadow of capital. And I believe that that's actually the work that you'll be drawing on today. So that's quite exciting. Prof, by way of introduction, in terms of our own work, we're quite a diverse school of economics based here at the University of Johannesburg, with colleagues working across the areas of kind of broadly economic development, and to do with kind of African development issues, value chains, production, manufacturing, industrial development, etc., right through to work on local communities through our local economic development programs, work on markets, market structure, and socioeconomic power as it relates to inclusion issues in our society, which I'm sure you'll know are very prominent across gender, across socioeconomic status, and other kind of lenses. And we are building the school to be one that is highly kind of internationally connected. A key part of our strategy, in fact, is to connect more broadly through our research groups, such as the EDWRG and others, with colleagues across the board, across the oceans, particularly in light of the kind of one might simply frame as crazy kind of global political environment that we're all in at present. And so I think without kind of taking too much time, I just wanted to welcome you. We're excited to hear what you have to share with us. And of course, as Dr. Fred has said at the end, it'd be great to engage with the audience, some of our students and staff as well, by way of questions and that as well. So let me leave time for that. Thank you once again for joining us. It's an absolute treat for us and an honor. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the warm introduction. Thank you for the interest. So let me share my screen and go ahead and get going, and I'll take questions at the end. So let's see, share. Can everyone see?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can see.
I cannot. It's happening. Let's see. Share. Content only.
Yes, we can see the screen still. Oh, yes, we can see it now.
Okay, let's see. I can't see. Let's see.
Okay.
Let me start again. Give me 1 second. Okay.
Okay. Oh, yes. Perfect, we can see.
Oh man, I don't know what's going on. Give me one. Let me stop sharing.
Okay. No problem.
Start again.
So it disappears from your side, sorry.
Sorry, let me start again. Stop sharing. Okay, let me start again. Sorry. Okay, let me start sharing again. Window. Oops. Sorry. Okay.
Okay, we can see the screen now from our side. It's
okay?
Yes, we can still see the screen. Can you still see? Are you fine?
Okay, so everyone can
Yes.
see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Let
Yes.
me go ahead and get going. So thank you and the opportunity to talk about this book, Death by Design. It's organized into these 5 parts. I'm going to begin with an introduction, briefly share findings and arguments from each part of the book, and then offer some concluding thoughts. I'm going to spend longer on part 1 relative to the other sections. So let me first begin with a quote by Eric Peter Ekholm and his book, The Picture of Health. Individuals who enjoy good health rightly think of themselves as fortunate. But luck has little to do with the patterns of disease and mortality that prevail in each society. The striking variations in health conditions among countries and cultural groups reflect differences in social and physical environments. And increasingly, the forces that shape health patterns are set in motion by human activities and decisions. Indeed, in creating its way of life, each society creates its way of death. So it's important, I think, to start by stating the obvious. We're all going to die of something someday. And as far as I'm aware, people like Peter Thiel have not yet found a pill for human immortality. But who gets sick and dies, when, how, and importantly, where in a society? It's unequal and it's predictable. So, for example, death is not randomly distributed across the US. As you can see, people living in states like California, that's the CA on the left, of the map. Minnesota, which is right in the middle and the top, MN, and West Virginia to the east. People living in California, Minnesota, and New York can expect to live about 79 years, while those living in states like Mississippi and West Virginia in the south of the US can expect to live 70 to 71 years, an 8 to 9 year difference. And what this map makes clear is that where you're born and where you live seem to have something to do with how long you live. Let me show you something closer to home. I pulled this data from Stats SA, mid-year population estimates, and they're showing you life expectancy by province in South Africa for women and men. And you can see that even in South Africa, death is not randomly distributed. So you can see, for example, for women in the Western Cape can expect to live 72.2 years. Can you all hear me?
Yes, can we please get everybody to mute? Please mute. Thank you. Sorry for that.
So as you can see in Western Cape, women can expect to live 72.2 years, but that's in contrast to Free State, which where women can expect to live only 64 years. Similarly, for men, you can see in Western Cape, men can expect to live 67.6 years, in contrast to men in Free State who can expect to live 57.3 years. And so you can see an almost 10-year difference for men in states that are not far apart, even in South Africa. And so death is not randomly distributed, is the point I want to make. And so what I'm going to argue using the case of Washington, D.C., is that the distribution of death in the United States reflects a complex interaction of social policies that created disproportionate vulnerability to premature illness and death among African Americans. And so what I'm calling death by design. And so what I'm going to argue is that the racial distribution of premature illness and death in Washington, D.C., the focus of today's study, is the product of multiple overlapping policy decisions deployed in a redundant fashion by a range of institutions, and that these policies were anchored in the social organization and design of space. And indeed, the non-random distribution of diseases and their tendency to disproportionately cluster among places and people groups is a product of what I call social containment. And here I intend the term to encapsulate both physical segregation, so the physical separation of groups on the basis of a particular characteristic such as income or race, as well as Max Weber's concept of social closure, or Charles Tilley's concept of opportunity hoarding, so the clustering together of privileges by and for particular groups of people. And critically, these processes are anchored in inclusion and exclusion from physical and social space. Steve Lerner's concept of sacrifice zones captures the idea that certain spaces in a city or state are more likely to contain toxic waste dumps, be located near high pollution highways, be built on environmentally tenuous land, for example. And such spaces are contained through physical and natural barriers such as highways, railway tracks, and parks, separating affluent, middle income, and poor neighborhoods and people, with racial minorities often contained in the poorest and most unhealthy places in a setting. So in this way, processes of social containment, in this case racial containment, also create and then cluster among marginalized individuals, families, and neighborhoods, producing disproportionate illness and death among them. And so syndemic zones are thus not benign, but advertently or inadvertently planned or designed. And so racial health inequality is one of the most intransigent and enduring forms of inequality in the United States. And the nation's capital is an important place in which to examine its production. So the contemporary health story of Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, is a tale of two cities, a white D.C. and a black D.C. In a small city that's just over 68 square miles or 177 square kilometers, perhaps the most stark difference relates to life expectancy. There's currently an 18-year gap between white and black men, an almost 2-decade difference, and about a 12-year gap between white and black women, just over a decade difference. And this is the largest racial life expectancy gap in the nation, whether compared to states, territories, or the 30 largest cities in the United States. So just to put this in historical perspective, this gap, 18 years for men and 12 years for women, is where the average life expectancy gaps in the US were a century ago. So you can see for men, this is where the US was in 1902 to 1905. And for women, this is where the gap was where the US was in 1929 to 1932. So it's a century behind. And Black vulnerability to premature death starts early, during infancy, among young people. Young men in the US aged 15 to 34 account for 89% of homicides. Black people are 10 times more likely to be victims. At older ages, Black people die at twice the rates of white people of heart disease and 6 times the rate for diabetes. And the most recent epidemics, HIV, AIDS, and COVID-19, show the same stubborn pattern. This is showing you cumulative AIDS mortality by race ethnicity. And what you're seeing here people is at the top. For white people, the line is the next one down, and Hispanic and other ethnic groups at the bottom. And what this is showing is, in fact, after antiretroviral therapy, that's the HAART, highly active antiretroviral therapy, things actually got worse for Black people, while for white people, AIDS death stabilized. I'll come back to this at the end. You can see the same thing for COVID-19 mortality. The red is deaths, and the light blue is showing you the proportion of the population. So you can see that Black people had 3/4 of COVID deaths, even though they comprised less than half of the city's population. In contrast, white people comprised about 1/3 of the city, 37%, but only 8.9%. And so overall, these statistics suggest that African Americans in Washington, D.C. are experiencing not just a single disease epidemic, but syndemic disease. Syndemics, coined by medical anthropologist Merrill Singer, describe multiple overlapping and interacting epidemics, which generate and exacerbate disease vulnerability in the population. Syndemics are dangerous because individual epidemics interact and amplify each other, increasing incidence of each individual disease. We saw this with the COVID epidemic in the US. It took advantage of pre-existing diabetes and heart disease epidemics and subsequently amplified the opioid, homicide, and mental illness epidemics. And so how did DC become a syndemic city? The first part of the book examines this question, starting from the city's founding in 1790. And so Washington, D.C. owes its elegant design to Frenchman Pierre L'Enfant, who, as Fletcher describes, envisaged a grand capital of wide avenues, public squares, and inspiring buildings in what was then a district of hills, forests, marshes, and plantations. And this plan had to accommodate large waves of in-migration driven by growth of the federal government, often due to wars, the city's status as a haven for free Black people and those who were escaping slavery, and European immigration. Migrants faced the challenge of finding housing within walking distance of their workplaces, as this was prior to trams and cars. But housing was both racially and economically segregated, creating a complex residential geography throughout the city. And the physical layout of the city with its wide avenues lent itself to grand houses along the streets and substantial land in the back. As opportunity, landowners rapidly put up housing of widely varying but often substandard quality in the backyards facing internal alleys. So this was a mix of shacks, shanties, wooden row houses, and tenements. As Paul Groves noted, quote, alley properties were handsome investments, commonly realizing from 10 to 20% per annum or per year on initial capital and rent. Even for the most affluent alley dweller, could take as much as 40% of his income. And so wealthy white people and some wealthy Black families found housing on predominantly street fronts. Borchardt found that Black people comprised about 9% of the street front population, especially within Black enclaves. And poor immigrant whites, so German, Irish immigrants, and poor Black families found housing in overcrowded, confined, and predominantly racially segregated alleys behind the main houses. And so this is a closer look at Borchardt's chart, where he used a combination of the census and city directories to construct a micro-level picture of this street front backstreet arrangement. So you can see here a row of white circles is where native-born white people lived. In the backyards is where the foreign-born white people lived, so the German and Irish immigrants. And here in goat alleys where Black people lived. And so this map, using data from the 1880 census, shows you a more bird's eye view of the city. And so as you can see, Black people are dispersed throughout the city, but in a fashion that Rueff and Grigorieva called tertiary segregation. So this street front, back street arrangement. And this was the preferred form of segregation across the US South. And alleys were clearly hazardous for health. Street front houses would typically throw their garbage into the alleys for removal by the city. And this included decomposing animal and vegetable matter, dead household pests like rats, which were killed with arsenic and tossed into the backyard. And alleys didn't have running water or sewers. And toilets were also in the back and limited in number. And the city wasn't good at cleaning up the alleys because it was expensive. So in a supplemental report to the Board of Health in 1872, a time when 81% of the population was Black, titled Filthy Alleys, T.S. Verdi, the health officer, described how the alleys received the filth that flows from almost every house in the city and how they were repository of all disgusting and foul refuse of our dwellings. And it wasn't only the condition of the streets in front of the alleys, but the alleys themselves. So an 1877 report showed a health officer describing mean cabins which were made of felt, tar, shingles, rags, tin, gravel, boards and holes, floors damp and broken. So domiciled are families with all the dignity of tenants having rent to pay. And alley dwelling had clear and obvious health implications. Overall, between 1876 and 1890, Black people died at twice the rates of white people. So you're looking here at mortality tables from the Board of Health report. The main causes of death were multiple overlapping communicable diseases, so infectious diseases, and about half of all the deaths were among children under the age of 5. So W.D. Stewart, health officer in the report, talked about this extraordinary waste of human lives, so largely represented by one class, the colored, and this is what Black people in the United States were called at the time. So over the next few decades, succeeding groups of social activists campaigned for the construction of low-income housing and the removal of alley housing due to poor health conditions. And after multiple delays, the government responded. However, the response was not what activists had anticipated. Documented national process called urban renewal, where thousands of Black homes were destroyed and poor Black people were displaced in the name of health and the City Beautiful movement. So as commented by a reporter in the Pittsburgh Washington Courier 1949, cited in Howard Gillette, the plea that thousands of Negroes will lose their life savings and become renters or objects of charity. Hundreds of Negro and business enterprises will be wiped out. Hundreds of churches will be destroyed and their membership scattered. Negro professional men will lose their clientele. Is seen as a poor excuse for not making Washington the most beautiful city in the world, end quote. And so buildings were torn down, as you can see in the image below. New units were built and priced to attract wealthy, predominantly white people. Federal interstate highways were built to service those who are moving out of the city into the suburbs. And people living in this area were relocated to segregated public housing, many placed in the middle of stable middle-class Black neighborhoods. So the net result of these and other urban renewal efforts around the city on racialized space was stark. And so as you can see, this first figure on the left is what you saw from 1880, and you can see what happens by 1930 onwards, a really dramatic shift in the racial composition of the city. And so as noted in an 1848 report, less than a third of the capital's inhabitants are Negro, but 2/3 of its slum inhabitants are Negro. Looked at it in one way, the colored people are being contained. And this racial containment was overseen, sanctioned, and pursued by a long series of senators and congressmen sitting in the respective district committees who controlled city government. In 1944, for example, Senator Theodore Bilbo, chairman of the Senate District Committee, so I could keep Washington a segregated city. So this was very explicit. The Washington Real Estate Board stated as early as 1921, no property in a white section should ever be sold, rented, advertised, or offered to colored people. The Federal Housing Association administration didn't insure people buying homes in predominantly Black areas or areas that might become Black. This is an excerpt from a confidential Federal Housing Administration report uncovered by Sarah Schoenfeld from Prologue, DC, where it said the Negro problem has not improved. In communities where there's any possibility of infiltration, application for insurance should be rejected. And the banks followed the cue of the FHA in their mortgage approval process. And so this is a map from 1937, also uncovered by Sarah Schoenfeld, showing the FHA's coding of areas of the city and its suburbs, with the A darker areas being the best. In the Northwest, loan-worthy areas, and the lighter areas, H, being the worst. And so you can see the beginnings of wealth creation among white families who are able to buy houses in the northwest of the city, and many Black people consigned to lives as renters in the east and south. Some Black families were able to buy, as Tanya Gulash Boza has shown, but for many Black people, they were consigned to lives as renters. And so in combination, this created a significant housing crunch for many Black people, shut out of segregated suburbs. If they are racially segregated suburbs, if they didn't stay in public housing, wealthier Black people were confronted with limited purchasing possibilities, with limited Black people were confronted with limited low-income housing, as its production didn't keep up with the destruction of alley housing. As a result, Black people paid significantly more money for renting and buying. Some accounts suggest up to 30% more money than white people because of housing demand. So many families
Please.
doubled up, creating overcrowding conditions in poor quality housing. And so this is for a report that suggested that in the census, Black people were 2.5 times as likely as white people to live in a dwelling containing 6 or more people. And the quality of housing needing structural repair, no toilets, heating, running water, or electricity. And these living conditions had health consequences. So a 1948 report by the National Committee on Segregation in the nation's capital documented large racial health disparities, startlingly similar to those 50 to 70 years later, which I showed you earlier. So these are some excerpts. Black people live 10 to 12 years less than white residents, higher chance of dying compared to other parts of the country, higher TB, higher infant mortality, and higher maternal mortality. So in the next half century, the city became the quintessential chocolate city. It was about 35% Black in 1950, but by 1970, 71% of the population was Black. And this was due to mass out-migration by white people, followed by migration by middle class and Black people once the suburbs opened up, as Karen Lacey has documented. And so Washington, D.C. remained a majority Black city until the turn of the century, but notice this clear west-east racial line of separation. Now, many people during the urban renewal era and onwards were displaced into public housing. By 1965, Washington, D.C.'s housing agency had constructed 37 public housing projects, more than half of which were located in the southeast of the city, with many others located in the northeast and southwest of the city. Over 41,000 people lived in the projects. And many of the people displaced in that area I showed you were funneled into public. 98% of residents were Black and 60% of residents lived at or below the poverty line. Historian Justin Shapiro documents how new public housing was often built on ecologically poor land, which in the Chocolate City era led to quick deterioration of buildings due to flooding and fires, and subsequent neglect or lack of funds available from Congress or the city to do repairs or timely maintenance. Toxic waste dumps and city highways were also located near public housing buildings. In an eerie similarity to the past, let me give you the example of Kenilworth Courts. It was sited near the 6-lane Kenilworth Avenue freeway or highway and next to the city's municipal dump, which was operated as an open land burn fill. So Shapiro describes Area E was to receive 600 cubic yards of ash residue per day, 6 days per week for several weeks. The residue was to be delivered while still smoldering. Once deposited, it would be quenched and compacted to 6 inches each day. And dumping would not cease until the early 1970s, which meant that Kenilworth Court's tenants faced months during which trucks carrying incinerator ash and refuse from other parts of the city ran down Kenilworth Avenue freeway to deposit their loads on the site near their homes. Hello? Can you hear me still?
I'm sorry. Yes, we can hear you. Please, can you just not share your screen? Someone is sharing their screen in the session.
Okay.
One of the participants, I'm just trying to see who it is. Please unshare your screen. Mokoro, please, if you can hear me, please leave the session or just stop sharing your screen. I'm trying to find them here in the session. I'm so sorry for that interruption,
Oh,
Prof.
that's okay.
I'm just going to remove them from the session and then they can join again. Let me just remove because I don't think they managed. Okay, sorry, you can share again.
Okay.
Apologies for that.
No, that's okay. Okay, let me share window. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see the screen. If you can just, I think, make it enlarge
Bigger?
it, or yeah, then that's fine. I think that's perfectly fine. Yes.
Can you see?
Yes, everything is perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. So when the dumping finally did end, the Kenilworth park contained about 4 million tons of raw refuse, incinerator ash, and other burnt residue. It had an average depth of 25 feet and covered an area of about 145 acres. And so in some, the alley and slum conditions public housing had been designed to eliminate had simply been reproduced. In the case of Kenilworth Courts, almost exactly, as the city literally dumped its garbage at its doorstep. The public housing projects became ground zero for the next syndemic during the Chocolate City era. And so Washington, D.C. is now what Derek Hyra has called a cappuccino city, with less than half of residents now Black. By 2010, a year before my study began, 52% of the DC population was Black, and by 2020,
Please mute. I see there's people unmuted. Please mute your microphone. Prof, sorry, you're muted. Somebody just muted you. Sorry, I'm not sure who muted you, but I think somebody muted you by mistake. I'm so sorry. Please don't press the mute all button, anyone in the meeting. Can I hear you? Can you, Prof Majola, can we hear you? I can't hear you at a moment. I'm not sure if it's just me. Maybe it's just me. I'm not sure if everyone else can hear the presenter. Let's check. Sorry. Yeah, no, sorry. Please don't press the mute all button if people are muting. Let me just check if I can't. Okay. Prof, I'll unmute you now. I think you're unmuted now. Yes.
Okay.
So you can just share again. Sorry.
Share.
Okay.
Oh, my screen is not sharing. Give me 1 second.
Sorry. From our side, we can see it, but yes, I think we just need to maybe stop sharing again and we can continue.
Oh, so you can see the Cappuccino City map?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Okay, then I'll just keep going. Okay, so and so these maps are showing you the racial distribution of the city in 2010 and 2020 on your left, with darker areas having more Black people, as well as the socioeconomic distribution on your right, with darker areas having wealthier people. And so the maps clearly illustrate that Black people are more likely to live in the east and south of the city, and more likely to have lower incomes compared to white people, with stark inequalities across wards. And so, as I've shown so far, the spatialized racial distribution of the city is non-accidental and translates into the spatial patterning of health outcomes. And so, as this map shows, death is not randomly distributed across the city. This map shows life expectancy, the sum of all these outcomes across the city. So wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods in the north, the dark red areas have higher life expectancy compared to poor Black neighborhoods, which have the lowest life expectancy to the east and south of the city. So just to give you some specifics, Woodley 51 right here, life expectancy 89 years, Elizabeth's here, life expectancy 68 years. So you have a 21-year difference in life expectancy, and they're only 8 miles apart. And so in the next parts of the book 2 to 5, I try and look at how racial containment structured the internal social dynamics underlying substance abuse, violence, and AIDS, or the SAVA syndemic, as well as individual experiences of life within syndemic zones. I also explore how and why efforts to control the city's health crises were so often frustrated, and why even when interventions were extraordinarily successful, they had so little effect on racial health inequality. So this next section will be much briefer. I'll just briefly touch on each of the parts. In part 2, I look at sex, love, and HIV in a syndemic zone. So in the United States, sex tends to be racially homogamous. That is, survey data suggests that most people tend to have sex with people of their same race. As a result, when infectious diseases such as HIV arrive in a community, they spread in racially concentrated ways. And so you saw this figure earlier for AIDS mortality. This is the figure for HIV. And you can see, again, dramatically higher HIV for Black people compared to other race ethnic groups. And this is in part due to racial containment, which concentrates Black life in particular parts of the city. And so Black heterosexual women and Black men who have sex with men in the US now have the highest HIV incidence or rates of new cases in the city. And part 2 of the book tries to understand. And so for heterosexual cis, so this is people who are assigned female at birth and live as women, and trans women are people who are assigned men at birth but now live as women. So for heterosexual cis and transgender Black women, risk came with a perceived shortage of available partners, resulting in concurrent or overlapping partners and low condom use, both of which are strongly associated with HIV acquisition and transmission. So in my interviews, many women respondents described why they tolerated male partners who had concurrent partners and why they might not use condoms. And so here's some excerpts. Ida commented, these are all pseudonyms. He was a good provider in the home. He took care of the home. The fact that he was a good provider, great provider, was enough. Cheryl explained how she ended up getting in a long-term relationship with this guy who took care of me, but he also hit her. And she stayed. I did what he wanted him to do because he was taking care of me. Hazel described the challenge of condom use. So then you have to have lots of self-esteem and not be in an economically low place where when you meet a man, you've got to go with what he says. And finally, Alyssa talked about why. I asked her why, and she said, with such a shortage of men, of good men. I said, why is there a shortage of men? She said, most of them are locked up, first of all, incarcerated. A lot of the straight good men are locked up. So you have there's only so many of them left on the street. I wanted to look at just how bad the partner shortage was. And this figure is showing you what William Julius Wilson and Catherine Neckerman called a marriageable male pool index to estimate the proportion of so-called marriageable men, that is, men who are alive, single, employed, and not in prison, relative to women who are never married in Washington, D.C., aged 20 to 49. And so what you're seeing is dramatically different marriage markets for Black and white women in Washington, D.C. In the 1980s, when the HIV epidemic began, while never married white women experienced near parity, so almost 100 marriageable men for 100 marriageable women. Similarly, aged Black women experienced severe partner shortages with fewer than 60 marriageable Black men per 100 Black women after 1970, and fewer than 50 marriageable Black men per 100 Black women after 1995. So the figure shows the consequences of high homicide rates and mass incarceration among young Black men in particular, as well as high male unemployment on the marriage market for Black women. So partner shortage by this measure was not just a perception, but a reality. And this is reflected, as I show in the book, in low marriage rates, especially for women who are in their 20s and 30s in the 80s and 90s, the high homicide and prison boom years. So Black women were more likely to experience partner churning or partner turnover when HIV was at its peak, making them more vulnerable than white women. So in the third part of the book, I delve more deeply into these interactions among overlapping substance abuse, violence, and AIDS epidemics, the SARS epidemic that unfolded between 1960 and 2022. So I found that the city experienced at least 6 cascading major substance abuse epidemics from the 60s to the 1990s. There were 3 heroin epidemics, which you can see depicted here, the 3 waves. There were 2 cocaine epidemics and a PCP or angel dust epidemic, which is a synthetic drug. And the ones that mattered most for the HIV epidemic were this last heroin wave, with injecting heroin drug users who shared needles, and the crack cocaine epidemic because some people addicted to drugs sold sex to pay for their habit. So many of my respondents got caught up in some way in these epidemics. And each drug epidemic gave birth to a homicide epidemic, leading to a homicide drug syndemic. So here you can see the dots of drug markets aligned with the dots for the homicide locations. And this was, as you can see, in the east and south of the city, and young Black men were disproportionately more likely to die of homicide. And this figure shows you that the worst of the drug homicide syndemics were in the late 60s and the early 1990s, when Washington, D.C. had the worst homicide rate in the country. But when we add AIDS to this, we see that deaths due to AIDS far surpassed those due to homicide during this period. This is the orange line. And notably, in the absence of antiretroviral therapy, AIDS deaths would have just continued to rapidly climb. And death was not just racially disparate, but also spatially distributed throughout the city. These are from the DC Health Report, and you can see that AIDS, homicide, and assault deaths were highest in the poorest wards in the southeast, so the dark blue sections, wards 7 and 8, which also had the highest proportions of Black residents, and very little AIDS or homicide deaths in Ward 3, the yellow section of the map. And so let me get into what it was like to live in a syndemic zone. So this is a typical description of what I call the density of death. Ruth describes losing half a network to AIDS. Nobody's around. Half of them are wind up catching the same disease. And so she talks about how maybe 30, 40 people she used to get high with, they're gone. Priscilla was diagnosed in 1998, and she showed me a picture. Every one of these girls, no, well, wait a minute. This one, this one, this one, this one, this one, all of them are dead. This girl here and I were the only two still alive. And when they died, I knew what they died from. Trans woman Maggie describes her mother's pain as a city syndemic tore through her family. Are you still in touch with your siblings and grandparents? My oldest brother's dead. He got killed in 92. My little brother is doing life without parole. He got arrested in 92. And I think that was about the same time when my mother found out I was HIV positive. So you can understand how devastating it was for my mother that year. What was he in for? My younger brother, kingpin status, drug lord, which consists of a whole umbrella of things like murders, kidnappings, major drugs, weapons, all that. My older brother was stabbed in his neck in the streets because of his addiction. So all this happened in 92. That's when my mother found out I was HIV positive. So that was a terrible year for her. The primary response to the city's drug and violence syndemic was mass incarceration. And Washington, D.C., the home of the architects of the war on drugs, undertook a particularly vigorous campaign called Operation Clean Sweep to arrest both buyers and dealers of drugs, focusing on public housing projects and city streets in Black areas. Police were assigned to the role of the agency of first response, and the police chief was frustrated, saying, "What more do you want us to do? We arrested 43,000 people last year." And DC's mass incarceration took on a somewhat surreal quality. By 1997, 49.9% of DC's African-American men aged 18 to 35 were under some form of criminal justice supervision. And this is not a typo. It really is almost half. This was 36 times the rate for white incarceration. So 10% were in jail or prison, 21% on probation or parole, 19% had warrants or were awaiting trial. So it essentially committed half the city's young Black men to a sort of social death. It also limited the dating pool for women, contributing to the partner shortage that Alyssa described earlier. Because so many young Black men were swept up in the criminal justice system, prisons were often spaces housing social networks of people who are friends outside of prison. So Theo, for example, describes it was kind of like being in the project, but no women there, just all guys. Everybody kind of knew everybody. You had people from northwest, southeast, people were brothers, cousins. And so I found that drug use continued in prison. People would get needles from diabetics Sex is illegal in U.S. prisons, but obviously sexual relationships continued, everything from rape, bondage to casual, consensual, and long-term relationships. And condoms were rarely available in prison. And all my respondents were living with HIV. So the reason this is particularly important is many of my respondents who spent time in prison were first imprisoned in youth and cycled in and out over a period of 2 to 29 years, sometimes for new crimes, sometimes for parole violations, such as dirty urine relating to drug use. So went in when I was 21, out at 23, back at 24, out at 28, in at 30, out at 38. And so the structural pool of parole violations and drug addiction, along with recruitment from prison zip codes, combined to heighten the potential for acquisition and transmission of HIV through the cyclical prison migration. And migration has been tied to rising community HIV and AIDS rates. So just the final part, I'll be really brief here. I try and understand how the city attempted to control the AIDS epidemic. And so you saw this earlier, and just to put this in different terms, before antiretroviral medication, Black people died at 2.5 times the rates of white people, but after medication, Black people died at 11 times the rates of Black people. And so things seem to get worse even when medicine was available, and this part of the book tries to understand why. And so the city was a pioneer in the beginning, a longtime supporter of the city's gay community, allocated money to the clinic, was the first contract in the nation, took on insurance companies, the first shelter in the nation for women. But what I found was that racial containment played out through racially differential spend. More money went to white than Black organizations. The city had a big budget crisis because money was going to criminal justice. It cost about $23,000 per prisoner per year, for example. So to close the budget deficit, the city cut AIDS and substance abuse programming for the poor and stopped funding AIDS community organizations, stopped paying for AIDS drugs in order to save money. So this made things worse and created more death. I also found a lot of scandals in the HIV agency, which I talk about in the book. But when the city finally got its act together, the interventions ended up with a spectacular result. So when they started needle exchange programs, when the ban was lifted, you can see an almost complete halt in new cases for HIV from injecting drug use. HIV diagnoses went down. The orange line shows you a dramatic decrease in the number of new cases. But when I broke the results down by race, you see that it's really the same tale of two epidemics. The line is showing you AIDS deaths, and so you can see dramatically different AIDS death levels stabilizing at a high rate for Black people. The bars are showing you the number of people living with HIV. You see there are many more Black people. You can see similarly when it comes to the proportions, Black people comprise 67% of new cases, 79% of AIDS deaths, and again, freely available medication. And the spatial relationship hasn't changed. The darker areas have the highest HIV cases and the largest proportion of Black people. So let me just offer some concluding thoughts. I want to make sure there's a bit of time for questions. So first, I began by arguing that death is not randomly distributed across the city, and that instead the city's health crises were built into and institutionalized in the creation of syndemic zones in Washington, D.C. And I try to place these different disease outcomes in historical context to understand why the city continues to combat racialized health crises decade after decade, century after century, and why they're so intransigent and hard to improve. I drew on archival material to show how this process of containment unfolded through alley housing, containment in specific neighborhoods, steer to particular parts of the city through discrimination, destruction of housing, livelihoods, and businesses, displacement and funneling into public housing, and disinvestment or neglecting Black spaces. And I showed how health was a motivation for this. I then tried to show more briefly the consequences of this for historical and contemporary health outcomes, showing how epidemics interact, and showing how technocratic expertise and universal healthcare are necessary but not sufficient in neutralizing the role of racial containment. And so overall, my work highlights the value of bringing history back into understanding racial health inequality, pursuing a holistic multi-disease approach to improving health in a community, showing the similar roots and dynamics that give birth to multiple epidemics. And it also suggests that to truly tackle racial health inequality, targeted programs aimed at changing behavior only go so far if you're not changing spaces, syndemic zones. So we need place-based interventions, investing in root cause institutions such as schools, and changing racialized policies and institutional logics that perpetuate disadvantage using a whole system approach. Otherwise, racial health inequality will simply persist and be reproduced as it did with COVID when the next epidemic comes along. And so just a few acknowledgements, a lot of assistance, primary funding, and fellowships, and I look forward to your comments and questions. So let me stop sharing and
Thank you very much, Prof. Majola. I think that was a very insightful, a deep presentation, and I think highly relevant. And we really want to say thank you very much for taking time. I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, so I would like to give the floor for a few academics to ask a few insightful questions. I see here there's a question from Dr. Gurpreet Kaur from India, who is one of our delegates from that side, who has a question for you. So let's take her question first. Dr. Gurpreet, yes.
I'm audible.
Hi, yes. Yes, we can hear you.
All are doing well. And congratulations.
Please put your volume up.
I'm audible now.
Yes.
Okay. So that was a very great presentation and you worked very well. I congratulate you for your great work. I think I missed something maybe. So that's why I have two queries regarding that. Why do multiple epidemics like HIV, AIDS, all these things, homicide also you have pointed out, disproportionately affects the Black communities in the same geographic area? And second query is related with the public policies, that how do public policies reinforce or mitigate the racial health inequality over time, according to you? That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe I'll collect a few questions. Are there other questions?
Okay, let us see. I just want to see if there's more hands here from our academics. I just want to give the floor first off to the academics, as I know this is also a learning opportunity for our students. So let me see if there's other questions. I see there is a hand raised here from Unati, but I'm not sure if they have a question or if that's just maybe a legacy hand. Let's see if they unmute, then they can ask. But let me see if there's any other questions from our academic community. I can't see any hands at the moment. Yes, I see there's one from Professor Thando Vilakazi and Professor Biasi.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you very much, Prof. Majola. This is truly fascinating. And of course, as you all know, very relevant in our kind of policy and research context as well. Just briefly, I mean, scanning around the world or even in other parts of the States, I guess, is there evidence showing kind of public policy or other types of interventions that reverse some of the patterns, or at least certainly lead to kind of stepwise changes in the patterns that you show us, for instance, on heart treatment, on expectancy, etc.? Or is it that there's kind of, I suppose, almost over time, a path dependency that is almost impossible to reverse in a sense? I mean, is there kind of silver lining? Is there evidence of active engagement that's actually started to change, where you see inflections in some of those charts? That might be interesting to hear as well. Thank you.
Great. So let me tackle those questions. So for the first one, the multiple epidemics, why do they affect Black people more? So part of what I'm trying to show is that the big mechanism is space. that oftentimes policies try and address individuals. They tell individuals to behave in a particular way, or they blame individuals for being bad people, making bad choices. And that's what I'm trying to show is that's not the whole story. That when you look at how space is organized, space is part of the problem. When you contain people in a particular space, and then disinvest in that space, you don't invest in the schools. So in trying to understand how do you have half the young Black men incarcerated, I looked at the school system. And so you start to see what is called the school to prison pipeline. The schools were crumbling. They didn't have good toilets. They didn't have working labs. They didn't have good heating. I found that Black kids were disproportionately punished and suspended. Once you're suspended, you're much more likely to drop out. Once you drop out, you're much more likely to become a juvenile delinquent. Once you're juvenile delinquent, you're much more likely to then go back and forth in prison. So I tried to show how is this actually produced. And I found that space, what you do in particular spaces, not enough hospitals, poor schools, poor transportation, poor access to jobs, that combination of things then leads to poor health outcomes. And when you particular groups of people or racial groups are in that particular space, that's when you end up with Black people being more affected. Your second question is linked to Dr. Tando's question about interventions and mitigation policies. Part of what I was trying to show was the reason why interventions seem to fail so often is that they're operating at the level of individuals. They're trying to get people to change behaviors, which is important, but without also changing the structure, the policies, the spaces in which people are living, you're just going to keep reproducing the same outcomes. And so in this particular case that I just talked about, in order to, the city budget was set up such that it was agencies were competing. So money going to criminal justice or prisons is money that's not going to schools. Money going to close the budget deficit was money that was cut out from AIDS programs. And so instead of going to root cause institutions, money was going to dealing with the symptoms or the problems. And so I think that the part of what I was trying to show is you have to focus on spaces and places and root causes rather than just focusing on symptoms. And there have been interventions, for example, focusing on improving schools in particular neighborhoods. So rather than just trying to get people to leave the neighborhood, actually trying to improve the neighborhood itself. And the other is getting more businesses, getting hospitals into particular neighborhoods, improving amenities in particular neighborhoods, as in addition to trying to help people to improve themselves and make better choices. But I'm really just sort of trying to say, if you don't take history into account and you don't sort of see that, gosh, we've been trying interventions aimed at individuals over and over and over again, we're not seeing change. Why? If you look above and look at the spaces that people are in and what is happening to the spaces that people are in, then you'll understand why the interventions are not working. And so as long as you disinvest in spaces, you're going to just keep getting the same outcome generation after generation, especially root cause institutions like schools. I think schools are really crucial. So I hope that answers some of the questions. Are there any more, or are we out of time?
It's such an interesting discussion, but unfortunately we're running out of time. Let me see if there's any more questions, but I think I would like to check if there's any more last minute questions from one of our colleagues or academics. Yes, Prof. Biasi.
Thank
You're
you so
muted.
much. Thanks, Prof. Majolo, for such a fascinating presentation, very illuminating. I just have one or two questions. I mean, I think, the way you've presented it, it sounds like it revolves around race, and I wondered whether, class, to some degree, plays a role, in terms of, understanding, the impact that, it had, but also education, whether the impact varied by class and education, and presumably even within the Black communities, you find that the impact varied depending on the class and depending on the education as well. But thank you so much. That was really fascinating.
Yeah, those are great questions. And in fact, that's a big thread in the book. I didn't focus on it much in the presentation, but class is big. It wasn't just about race. It was also about intra-class dimensions. And so what's striking to me, for example, and one of the questions I pose in the book is, why did racial health inequality get worse when Black people were leading? Right? If you notice, in the 1950s, it was like a 10 to 12 year difference in life expectancy, but the numbers I showed you was like 18 years for men by the time you get to the 2020s. So things actually got much worse. And so this is the puzzle I try and unpack in the last part of part one. And part of the story is race, like you say, you sort of have a path dependency in the sets of policies that were in place. They had to balance the budget or they would lose power to Congress. And the way in order to close the budget, they had to pursue gentrification because of property tax revenue. So they ended up displacing poor Black people. So Black mayors and the Black middle class were displacing the Black poor. And this is how racial inequality persists, is when you turn a group in on itself. And then you stand back and watch and say, you see, it's Black on Black, whatever, Black on Black crime, Black on Black. But this is how the system, how inequality perpetuates, is when you turn groups in on themselves. So similarly for the HIV, I found that the city supported the white gay community, but were homophobic toward the Black gay community. And this was reflected in the different funding decisions to Black and white organizations. Even when money was earmarked to poor parts of the city, it still found its way back to other places. So you had a middle class and poor Black divide as well. So class is a really important part of the story. And I try and show how it's not just indifference towards the poor, but also about how systems of inequality are set up. Women oppress women. This is how patriarchy perpetuates. And so it's not just specific to race, but other systems of inequality run when it gets groups to fight each other for the slim pickings. And so part of getting out of inequality is to understand how it works. Yeah. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. We've completely run out of time, so I'm so sorry for that. I think it's a discussion that can take us throughout this evening, but I know that's not what you can afford, Prof. So we would just want to say thank you very much. I have the honor to close today's session, and I just want to say thank you very much for such an insightful and deeply insightful presentation. I think it's so relevant to the South African context also, where we have so much inequality that is due to apartheid legacy, still spatial inequality, health inequality, access to healthcare, and where these issues persist even in South Africa. So there's such a strong relationship here and insights that we can draw from this. And I think everybody that was attending today can really give you a virtual hand of applause for this presentation. We have people here in EWRG that comes from different countries, but we also have a very unique characteristics here where we have students and academics and community leaders all engaging on this platform with equal voice. And we just want to say thank you very much for making time out of your busy schedule. We really look forward to reading the book and to gain more insights into this. And we really look forward to hosting you again at the EWRG with your next book and such an insightful and relevant work. So thank you very much, Prof. And I think we can all give a virtual hand of applause now to Prof. Mojala from the Princeton University.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to share my work.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to also say thank you very much for everybody attending. Thanks for all the students. I see there's still some hands raised, but I would just like to say I think we can take the communication radar off the line. So I think I would just like to say thank you very much for everybody attending, for all our guests, and also our acting director of the School of Economics. Thank you for also the introductions. Really look forward to the next session. And thank you very much for everybody. Have a great and awesome day further. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bri.